I was there every day while she was pregnant. I came home, I paid the bills, I stayed in the room. But there were nights she cried quietly beside me, holding her belly, realizing she was carrying everything alone. I didn't leave her then. I just stayed silent. I didn't leave my wife while she was pregnant. That's the part people usually expect to hear first. That's the part men are usually judged for. I didn't disappear. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't miss doctor's appointments because I was out running the streets. I came home every night. I paid the bills. I kept the lights on. I stayed. But what I didn't understand back then was that staying quiet can feel the same as being gone. And sometimes it hurts worse. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, well, at least he didn't leave, I thought the same thing for a long time. I told myself I was a good man because I didn't walk away. I told myself I was doing my part because I was present in the room. I told myself silence meant peace. What I didn't know was that silence has weight. And when a woman is carrying a child, that weight lands on her body, her mind, and her heart. Let me take you back. Not to the pregnancy just yet, but to who we were before everything went quiet. Because silence doesn't start all at once. It grows. When I met my wife, she wasn't loud, but she wasn't silent either. She had this way of talking that felt intentional, like she chose her words carefully, but when she spoke, she meant what she said. We met later in life, late 20s, early 30s. Both of us had already learned a few lessons the hard way. Both of us had already decided what we wouldn't tolerate anymore. She told me early on that communication mattered to her. I remember nodding like I understood. Truth is, I didn't. Not because I didn't care, but because I grew up believing that if nobody was yelling, everything was fine. In my house, silence meant survival. It meant nobody was angry enough to throw something. It meant the night would pass without trouble. So when my wife wanted to talk things through, my body heard danger, even when my mind didn't. And instead of explaining that, I shut down. She didn't know that at first. In the beginning, love covers a lot. You excuse what you don't yet understand. You tell yourself, he'll open up more with time, or she just needs patience. We were good at that stage. Not perfect, but good. We laughed, we planned, we talked about the kind of parents we'd be someday. And when she told me she was pregnant, I smiled. I hugged her. I said all the right words. But inside something shifted. Not fear exactly, more like pressure. The kind of pressure that makes you go quiet, not loud. She told me on a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were my long days at work. I came home tired, shoulders heavy, mind still clocked in. She was standing in the kitchen, hands slightly shaking, eyes searching my face. When she said it, my first thought wasn't joy, it was responsibility. That may sound cold, but if you've ever been a man raised to believe your worth is tied to what you provide, you understand what I'm saying. My mind went straight to numbers, money, insurance, time. Her mind went somewhere else entirely. She wanted reassurance, connection, presence. We were standing in the same kitchen, hearing the same news, living two completely different moments. She asked me how I felt. That question should have been easy, but it wasn't, because I didn't know how to say, I'm scared, but I'm here, without feeling like I was failing. So I said, we'll be all right. And then I went quiet. At first, the silence didn't seem dangerous. We still ate dinner together, still slept in the same bed, still showed up to appointments. From the outside, we probably looked solid. But inside that quiet, things were shifting. She asked questions about the baby, about the future, about us. I answered with facts, short sentences, practical responses. I didn't talk about feelings because I didn't have the language for them. And instead of learning, I withdrew. Not intentionally, not maliciously, just
slowly, like a door closing so quietly you don't hear the click. There's something about pregnancy that demands presence, not just physical presence, emotional presence, and I didn't know how to give that. I thought my job was to stay calm, to not add stress, to be the strong one. What I didn't realize was that calm without connection feels cold. She'd tell me she was tired. I'd tell her to rest. She'd tell me she was scared. I'd tell her everything would be fine. She'd tell me her body didn't feel like her own anymore. And I'd say nothing because I didn't know what to say. And because I didn't know what to say, I chose silence. Here's the part people don't talk about. Silence doesn't look like cruelty. It looks like distance. It looks like a man sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at his phone while his wife turns her back and cries quietly. It looks like unanswered questions hanging in the air until they stop being asked. It looks like a woman learning to carry her fears alone while the person she loves is right beside her. And the most dangerous thing about silence? You can convince yourself it's harmless. I told myself, at least I'm not arguing. At least I'm not yelling. At least I'm not leaving. But what I didn't understand was this. A woman doesn't need you to be perfect during pregnancy. She needs you to be present. And presence requires words. One night, she asked me something that should have stopped me in my tracks. She said, "Do you even want this baby?" That question didn't come out of nowhere. It came from weeks of emotional emptiness, from nights of one-sided conversations, from a growing sense that she was alone in something she shouldn't have been. I was offended, not because the question was unfair, but because it exposed something I hadn't wanted to face. I said, "Of course I do," but I didn't say anything else. No explanation, no reassurance, no softness, just words without warmth. She nodded, and something in her closed that night. I didn't see it then, but I see it now. Pregnancy has a way of revealing what's already there. It doesn't create distance, it magnifies it. And every time I chose silence over vulnerability, I taught her something. I taught her not to expect comfort, not to expect conversation, not to expect emotional safety. She stopped asking how I felt, stopped sharing her fears, stopped inviting me into her inner world. And I told myself, see, she's doing better. I mistook withdrawal for strength. I mistook quiet for peace. I mistook staying for loving. Here's a question for you, listening right now. Have you ever been in a room with someone who didn't leave, but wasn't really there? That's what I became, and I didn't know it. Not yet, because the real cost of silence doesn't show up immediately. It shows up later, after patterns are set, after emotional habits form, after someone learns how to survive without you, even while married to you. And by the time I realized something was wrong, she had already been alone for months. And that's where this story really begins, because silence during pregnancy doesn't end when the baby is born. It follows you into the delivery room, into the sleepless nights, into the years you assume will fix things on their own. In the next part, I'll tell you about the moment I first noticed the distance and still chose not to speak, and how that choice changed everything. By the second trimester, the pregnancy was no longer new. The surprise had worn off. The excitement had settled into routine, and routine has a way of exposing what people are avoiding. Her body was changing in ways neither of us could ignore anymore. She moved slower, she slept lighter, she carried discomfort in places I didn't know how to reach. And instead of stepping closer, I stepped inward. Not physically, emotionally. I started working later. Not because I had to, but because work felt simpler. At work, problems had solutions. You spoke, you fixed, you moved on. At home, emotions lingered. They didn't wrap up neatly. They required listening. And listening felt like standing still in a storm. So I kept busy. I told myself I was doing it for us, for the baby, for stability. But the truth? I was hiding in productivity. She noticed. Of course she did. Pregnant women notice everything, especially what isn't said. She'd ask how my day went. I'd answer with one sentence. She'd try to talk about names, fears, dreams. I'd nod, smile, change the subject. And slowly, she began matching my energy. Not because she wanted to, but because she was tired of reaching for something that wasn't reaching back. Here's the thing about emotional neglect. It doesn't announce itself. There's no argument, no explosion, no dramatic exit, just a quiet rebalancing. One person carries more, the other carries less, until the imbalance becomes the relationship. One evening, we were sitting on the couch. The TV was on, neither of us was watching. She rested her hand on her belly, staring straight ahead. Out of nowhere, she said, "I feel like I'm doing this alone." That sentence should have stopped time. It should have snapped me awake. But instead, I felt accused. And when I feel accused, I shut down. I said, "That's not fair." That was it. No curiosity, no follow-up, no "tell me more," just defense. She didn't argue. She just nodded again. And if you're wondering why I keep mentioning her nodding, it's because that's the moment she stopped fighting for connection. Let me tell you something. Most men don't realize until it's too late. When a woman stops arguing, that doesn't mean she's at peace. It usually means she's grieving. Grieving the version of you she thought she had. Grieving the support she hoped for. Grieving the idea that this moment, this pregnancy, would be shared. And I didn't know that. I thought silence meant acceptance. I was wrong. The doctor visits became quieter. She still went. I still went. But she stopped looking at me when the doctor spoke. She asked her questions directly. She answered alone. I sat there like furniture, present, but unnecessary. And instead of asking myself why, I told myself she was strong. That was my favorite excuse. She's strong. Strong enough to carry life, strong enough to handle emotions alone, strong enough to not need me. I didn't understand that strength was a mask she was forced to wear because I wouldn't show up emotionally. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever convinced yourself someone didn't need you just so you wouldn't have to face the fear of failing them? That's what I did. Because if she needed me and I didn't show up, that meant I was hurting her. And that truth felt heavier than silence. Around the 6th month, something changed. Not dramatically, subtly. She stopped inviting me into her world. She didn't ask if I wanted to feel the baby kick. She didn't tell me about her dreams anymore. She didn't share the weird fears that come at night when everything is quiet. At first, I enjoyed the peace. No emotional demands, no uncomfortable conversations, just calm. But calm without intimacy is lonely, and I felt it, even though I didn't admit it. One night, I woke up and noticed she wasn't in bed. I found her sitting on the edge of the bathtub, crying softly. Not sobbing, just leaking. I stood there for a second, unsure of what to do. Then I asked, "Are you okay?" She looked up at me. Her eyes weren't angry. They were tired. She said, "I don't know." That was an invitation, a real one, and I froze. Because "I don't know" doesn't have a quick fix. So instead of sitting beside her, I told her she should get some sleep. She nodded, again, and went back to bed. I stayed standing there longer than necessary, pretending I had done something helpful. That night, something broke. Not loudly, quietly. A kind of trust cracked. The trust that says, if I open up, you'll meet me there. She learned I wouldn't. And once someone learns that, they adapt. They close off. They survive. The baby shower came and went. People smiled, laughed, took pictures. Everyone told her how lucky she was. "You've got a good man," they said. I smiled at that, because from the outside, it was true. I hadn't left. But inside, she was carrying more than a child. She was carrying disappointment. As the due date approached, she became quieter than ever. Not withdrawn, just careful. She spoke when necessary, shared when required, but the emotional closeness we once had, it was gone, and I didn't know how to bring it back because silence had become my language, and unlearning it felt impossible. Here's something I wish someone had told me then. Silence doesn't protect relationships. It protects comfort. And comfort is a terrible reason to let someone you love feel alone. The night before labor started, she sat at the kitchen table, folding tiny clothes. She didn't ask for help. I watched from the doorway. Something about the scene felt final, like a chapter closing. I thought about saying something, about apologizing, about admitting I didn't know how to show up. But the words stayed stuck, and once again, I chose silence. The next morning, she went into labor, and I thought that would reset everything, that the baby would bring us back together, that shared exhaustion would create intimacy, that love would magically fill the space silence had hollowed out. I was wrong, because childbirth doesn't erase emotional neglect. It exposes it. And what happened in that delivery room was the moment I finally understood the cost of staying silent. But by then, it was already too late to undo what had been done. Labor doesn't start the way movies show it. There's no dramatic rush at first, no shouting, no chaos. It starts quietly. Discomfort, pressure, a look on her face that told me something had changed. She woke me up before sunrise. She didn't panic, didn't cry. She just said, "I think it's time." And for the first time in months, I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard in a while. Certainty. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Not tense, not angry, just empty. The kind of quiet where you feel like words would bounce off the walls and fall flat. I kept glancing at her. Her hand rested on her belly, her breathing steady, controlled. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking forward. And that should have told me something. Hospitals have their own language. Beeping machines, rubber soles on tile floors, low voices behind curtains. We checked in, answered questions, signed papers. I spoke when spoken to. She answered everything else. The nurse asked if she wanted an epidural. She looked at me, just for a second. That look wasn't a question, it was habit, a reflex. Then she turned back to the nurse and answered herself. I told myself it didn't matter, but something inside me tightened, because that moment confirmed what I had been avoiding. She didn't see me as emotional support anymore. I was a witness. They moved her into the delivery room. Bright lights, cold metal, a bed that looked nothing like comfort. She climbed in slowly, carefully. I stood off to the side. That's where I stayed. Not because anyone told me to, because I didn't know where else I belonged. Contractions came in waves. You could see them before she spoke. Her face tightened, her grip clenched. The nurse told her to breathe. She did. She didn't reach for me. That hurt more than I expected, but I didn't step forward either, because stepping forward meant engagement, and engagement meant vulnerability, and vulnerability still scared me. At one point, she cried out, not loudly, just a sound, sharp and raw. Instinctively, I took a step toward her. Then I stopped, because I didn't know what to say. And instead of saying the wrong thing, I said nothing. Again. The nurse took my place. She held her hand, spoke calmly, encouraged her. Another woman stepped into the role I should have been filling, and no one said a word about it, but everyone felt it. Time stretches strangely in delivery rooms. Minutes feel like hours. Hours blur together. I watched the clock more than I watched her. I told myself I was giving her space, but the truth? I was distancing myself from the intensity of the moment, because intensity demands presence, and presence demands words. At one point, she looked at me and said, "Can you come closer?" Not angrily, not pleading, just asking. And I did. I stood next to the bed, close enough to touch, still not touching, still quiet. She closed her eyes, and I realized something painful in that moment. She wasn't asking for comfort. She was checking to see if I could show up. And I didn't. Not fully. When the baby was born, everything happened fast. Voices overlapped. Instructions flew. Crying filled the room. The baby cried, healthy, strong. They placed the baby on her chest. She cried then, tears streaming down her face, relief, love, exhaustion. I watched. I smiled. I felt proud, but I also felt separate, like I was watching a moment through glass. The nurse asked if I wanted to cut the cord. I hesitated, then nodded. I did what I was supposed to do. Everyone said, "Congratulations." I thanked them. It all looked right, but something was missing, and I couldn't name it yet. Later, when the room quieted and the baby slept, she looked at me, really looked at me, and said something I wasn't ready to hear. She said, "I wish you had talked to me." Not accusing, not loud, just honest. I opened my mouth and nothing came out, because by then, silence had become my reflex, my shield, my curse. She turned away, and that moment, that simple turn of her body, felt heavier than the entire pregnancy, because it wasn't anger, it was resignation. We stayed in the hospital for 2 days. Visitors came and went. Everyone praised her strength. Everyone congratulated me. I accepted it all. But at night, when it was quiet, the silence between us felt different, thicker, permanent. Here's the thing about regret. It doesn't always announce itself right away. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it hides behind relief, behind gratitude, behind routine. And then, one day, it hits you in the smallest moment. On the second night, the baby wouldn't stop crying. She tried everything, rocking, feeding, walking. She looked exhausted. I offered to take the baby. She handed them to me without comment. I held that child in my arms, so small, so dependent, and for the first time, I felt the weight of everything I hadn't said, everything I hadn't given, everything I had withheld. I looked at my wife. She was lying back, eyes closed, not sleeping, just resting from carrying more than she should have had to. And I realized something that terrified me. I had been present for every moment, and still, I had missed her entirely. That realization stayed quiet, just like everything else. But it didn't leave. It followed us home, into the late-night feedings, into the growing distance, into the years that came next. Because childbirth doesn't reset silence, it cements it. And in the next part of the story, I'll tell you what happened when the house got quiet again and there was no nurse left to fill the space I had abandoned. That's when the real consequences began to show. Bringing a baby home is supposed to feel like a beginning. New routines, new rhythms, a new sense of purpose. For us, it felt like an echo. The house was full, but emotionally hollow. The baby cried, the television stayed on for noise, friends checked in, but between me and my wife, there was a quiet that no amount of activity could cover. The first night home, she moved through the house like someone who already knew how to be alone. She didn't ask for help, not because she didn't need it, because she had learned not to expect it. She changed diapers without commentary, fed the baby without complaint, moved with the calm efficiency of someone who had already adjusted to carrying things by herself. I watched. I told myself she had it handled. I told myself stepping in would be intrusive. What I didn't tell myself was the truth. I was still afraid of saying the wrong thing, and silence felt safer than learning. Sleep deprivation has a way of exposing cracks. Late nights blur patience, early mornings steal grace. She woke with the baby. I woke when the baby's crying got loud enough. I asked if she needed anything. She said, "No, I'm fine." And I believed her because I wanted to. Let me pause here and say something important. When someone says, "I'm fine," enough times without being checked on, eventually it stops being a statement. It becomes a boundary. And I helped build that boundary, brick by brick. With every quiet moment, I chose comfort over connection. Weeks passed. Visitors slowed. Life settled. And that's when the real silence moved in. No more congratulations, no more meals dropped off, no more excuses. Just us, and the distance we didn't know how to bridge. She stopped talking about her body, stopped talking about how pregnancy had changed her, stopped talking about fear. I told myself she was adjusting, but adjustment doesn't look like withdrawal. Adjustment looks like learning together. What we were doing was separating quietly. One night, I came home from work later than usual. She was in the living room, rocking the baby in the dark. Not because the lights were off, because she hadn't turned them on. I asked why. She said, "I didn't think it mattered." That sentence didn't make sense to me at the time, but it does now. Because when someone feels unseen long enough, they stop performing visibility. I sat down across from her, the baby finally asleep. I thought about starting a conversation. I really did. I even rehearsed it in my head. But something stopped me. Fear, maybe, or habit, or the weight of months of silence making the first word feel impossible. So instead, I asked if she wanted me to take the baby so she could sleep. She said no. Not harshly, just closed. That was the moment I first felt panic. Not loud panic, quiet panic. The kind that sits in your chest and asks uncomfortable questions, like, what if I've already missed something I can't get back? But instead of addressing that fear, I pushed it down, because acknowledging it meant admitting I had caused harm, and that was a truth I wasn't ready to carry. Parenthood has a way of magnifying who you already are. If you communicate, it deepens connection. If you avoid, it deepens distance. And I was an avoider. I started calling her strong more often. I said it like praise. "You're so strong. You've got this. I don't know how you do it." She never argued, never corrected me, but I didn't realize those words were landing differently than I intended Because "you're strong" can sound a lot like "you're on your own." One afternoon, she snapped. Just once. The baby wouldn't settle. She hadn't slept. I asked a simple question. "Why is the baby crying again?" She turned to me, eyes sharp, voice shaking. "Because they're a baby." Then she stopped, closed her eyes, and apologized. I stood there stunned, because I didn't expect the apology. She shouldn't have been the one apologizing, but silence teaches people to blame themselves, and I had taught her well. That night, I lay awake thinking about pregnancy, about the delivery room, about every moment I chose quiet instead of courage. And for the first time, I wondered something dangerous. What if she forgives me, but never feels close to me again? Weeks later, she said something casually that felt anything but casual. She said, "I don't think you like talking to me." She said it while washing bottles, not looking at me, as if it were already settled. I laughed nervously, said, "That's not true." She shrugged. That shrug was heavier than any argument we'd never had, because it meant she had already drawn a conclusion. Here's the thing about late regret. It doesn't come when the damage is happening. It comes when you finally see it clearly. And by then, patterns have roots. I wanted to fix things. I just didn't know how to start. Every attempt felt awkward, forced, like trying to speak a language I'd refused to learn. And every failed attempt made me retreat further. Silence was familiar, even when it hurt. She stopped sharing her inner life entirely. No dreams, no fears, no reflections, just logistics, schedules, needs, tasks. We became coworkers raising a child. Efficient, polite, disconnected. One night, months after the baby was born, she said something that still echoes in my mind. She said, "I don't feel lonely anymore." That should have sounded like good news, but it wasn't, because she didn't say it with relief. She said it with acceptance, like someone who had made peace with absence. I didn't respond. Of course I didn't. And in that moment, I realized something painful. Silence hadn't just failed her, it had reshaped our marriage, and I was running out of time to undo it. But I still didn't speak, because silence had become who I was in this relationship, and changing felt harder than losing. There's a moment in every long silence where the quiet stops feeling safe. It starts to feel fragile, like glass already cracked, one wrong word away from shattering. That's where I was. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly brave. What happened instead was smaller, more humiliating. I overheard her talking to someone else. It was a Saturday afternoon. I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, except for her voice. She was on the phone in the bedroom. I didn't mean to listen, but when you hear your name, you pause. She said, "I'm married, but I feel like a single parent." She didn't say it angrily. She didn't sound bitter. She sounded tired. And then she said something that cut deeper than anything she'd ever said to me directly. She said, "He's here, he's just not with me." I stood in the hallway holding my keys like they were suddenly too heavy, because hearing the truth spoken to someone else hits differently. It strips away your excuses. That night, I decided I would talk. Not later, not eventually. That night. I rehearsed the conversation in my head. I planned honesty, vulnerability. I told myself I'd finally explain that I wasn't cold. I was afraid. That I didn't stay silent because I didn't care. I stayed silent because I didn't know how to show care. I thought that would matter. After the baby was asleep, I sat beside her on the couch. She was folding laundry. Quiet, focused. I said her name. She looked up. Neutral. Not hopeful. That should have warned me. I told her I wanted to talk. She nodded, put the laundry down, waited. I started slow. I told her I knew I hadn't been present emotionally. I told her I knew she'd carried more than she should have. I told her I was sorry. The words came out clumsy but sincere, and when I finished, she didn't cry. She didn't yell. She didn't even react the way I expected. She just listened. And when I stopped talking, she said something that stunned me. She said, "I believe you." Then she added, "But I don't feel it." That sentence broke something in me, because belief without feeling is distance, and distance had already settled in too deeply. I asked her what she needed from me. She thought for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know if I know how to need you anymore." That's what silence does. It doesn't just create absence, it erodes dependency. I tried to explain myself, tried to talk about my upbringing, my fear of saying the wrong thing, my belief that staying calm was helping. She listened patiently, and then she said something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. She said, "I wasn't asking you to be calm, I was asking you to be with me." There was no anger in her voice, just clarity. Here's something people don't tell you about late apologies. They don't land the way you hope, because by the time you speak, the other person has already learned how to survive without your words. I asked her if we could try again. She didn't say no, but she didn't say yes either. She said, "I'm tired." And for the first time, I understood what kind of tired she meant. Not sleep tired, soul tired. The kind of tired that comes from carrying emotional weight alone for too long. After that conversation, things didn't magically improve. I talked more, but she guarded more. I showed effort, but she stayed cautious. Because trust doesn't rebuild at the speed of regret. It rebuilds at the speed of safety. And I hadn't been safe for her during the time she needed it most. I started noticing how self-contained she'd become. She made decisions without consulting me, handled challenges without mentioning them, shared her feelings with friends instead of me. And I couldn't blame her. I had taught her that I wasn't the place to bring those things. One night, months later, she said something quietly devastating. She said, "I don't miss talking to you the way I used to." She said it gently, like an observation, not a complaint. And that's when I realized something painful. She wasn't punishing me. She had adapted. Adaptation looks like strength, but it often comes from loss. I kept trying. I really did. But every attempt felt late, like arriving at the station after the train has already left. I had stayed silent during the season when my voice mattered most, and now words felt unnecessary to her. The hardest part wasn't her distance. It was realizing that silence had trained us both. Her to stop expecting, me to stop reaching. And unlearning that pattern felt overwhelming. One evening, she asked me a question that flipped everything. She said, If our child grows up and treats their partner the way you treated me during pregnancy, would you be okay with that? I didn't answer right away because I knew the truth. No, I wouldn't. And that realization crushed me because it meant I had failed in a way that would echo beyond our marriage. That night, I lay awake thinking about legacy, about what silence teaches, about what children absorb, and I wondered if staying silent had already written a story I couldn't revise. Time has a way of softening memories, not erasing them, just dulling their sharp edges enough for you to function. That's what happened to us. We didn't explode. We didn't separate dramatically. We didn't even argue much. We just continued. And continuation can be more dangerous than conflict. Our child grew. First words, first steps, first day of school. Life filled the space where conversation should have been. Schedules replaced intimacy. Logistics replaced vulnerability. We talked every day, just not about anything that mattered. From the outside, we looked stable. Two parents, a home, routine. People complimented us. "You make it look easy," they'd say. And I'd smile, because it was easy. That was the problem. Easy doesn't mean connected. Easy just means unchallenged. She became exceptionally capable, handled school forms, doctor appointments, social calendars. She didn't ask for input unless necessary, not out of spite, out of habit. And every time she handled something alone, a part of me felt relieved and ashamed. Relieved because I didn't have to engage emotionally, ashamed because I knew why she didn't ask anymore. Here's something I didn't expect. Silence doesn't just distance couples, it changes how you see yourself. I started thinking of myself as not emotional, as if that were a personality trait instead of a skill I never developed. I hid behind that label, used it to excuse the gap between us. But then something happened. Our child started asking questions, not about toys or homework, about feelings. They'd ask their mother things like, "Why do you look sad sometimes?" They'd ask me, "Why don't you talk a lot?" Kids notice patterns adults pretend are invisible, and every question felt like a mirror I didn't want to look into. One evening, years after the pregnancy, my wife said something quietly that shook me. She said, "I don't think you know me anymore." She said it matter-of-factly, like a conclusion she'd already accepted. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but the truth was, she was right. I knew her roles, mother, partner, organizer, but I didn't know her inner world because I hadn't earned access to it. I asked her what she meant. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "You don't ask questions that require real answers." That sentence stayed with me because it exposed something painful. Silence isn't just about not speaking, it's about not inquiring, not being curious, not wanting to know what's beneath the surface. I started noticing how differently she spoke to others, animated, open, engaged, and how different she was with me, polite, measured, contained. That contrast hurt. But again, I couldn't blame her. Years went by like that. No big fights, no dramatic exits, just a slow emotional erosion. And I convinced myself that this was what long marriages looked like. Quiet, functional, predictable. But deep down, I knew something essential was missing. Then came the moment that cracked everything open. Not all at once, but enough. Our child was a teenager by then. One evening, they asked me a question out of nowhere. They said, "Why don't you ever tell Mom how you feel?" I laughed it off, said something casual. But inside, I felt exposed, because if a child can see it, it's no longer invisible. That night, I lay awake thinking about the pregnancy, about the delivery room, about every time silence felt easier than courage, and for the first time, I wondered if staying silent had shaped not just my marriage, but my child's understanding of love. Regret at this stage doesn't feel sharp. It feels heavy, like carrying a box you packed yourself years ago and forgot about, until one day you open it and everything inside is still there, untouched. I tried again to talk, not in grand speeches, in small ways, asking questions, sharing thoughts, but it felt unnatural, like we were both speaking with accents we didn't trust. She answered kindly, but cautiously, because when silence becomes history, words feel suspicious. One evening, she said something that clarified everything. She said, "I don't think you meant to hurt me." Then she paused. And I think that's what hurts the most, because intent doesn't erase impact, and good intentions don't heal neglect. That was the moment I fully understood late regret. It's not loud, it's not dramatic. It's the quiet realization that you can see exactly where things went wrong and you can't go back. The moment didn't arrive with raised voices. There was no argument, no packed bags by the door, no slammed anything. It arrived the way everything else had in our marriage, quietly. It was an ordinary weekday evening. Dinner dishes drying in the rack, the television murmuring in the background, our child in their room, door half closed. She sat across from me at the table, hands folded, not tense, just settled. That should have been my first clue. She wasn't rehearsing. She wasn't nervous. She had already decided. She said my name, the way you say someone's name when you're not asking for anything anymore. I looked up. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I want you to listen without trying to fix it." That sentence alone should have terrified me, but instead I felt strangely calm, because part of me already knew. She took a breath, not shaky, measured, and then she said it. She said, "I don't feel emotionally married to you. Not angry married, not resentful married, just not married. Emotionally absent, like a title that no longer matched the role." I waited for the next sentence, for blame, for accusations. They didn't come. She continued. She said, "I realized something recently. I stopped hoping you would change a long time ago." That's when it hit me. Hope had been the last thread holding us together, and she had let it go. She explained it calmly, too calmly. She said the pregnancy was when it started. Not the baby, not stress, not exhaustion. The pregnancy. She said that was when she learned she couldn't lean on me emotionally, and once she learned that, she never fully unlearned it. She said something that still echoes in my chest. She said, "I needed you then, not now, not later, then." That word, then, carried years inside it. I finally spoke. I told her I knew I had failed her. I told her I'd grown. I told her I understood now. She nodded, and then she said something devastating. She said, "I believe you, but understanding now doesn't change how alone I felt then." And that's the truth people don't want to hear. Growth doesn't rewind damage. She wasn't leaving that night. She wasn't asking for space. She wasn't issuing an ultimatum. She was explaining her reality. She said she had built a life that didn't rely on me emotionally, not out of bitterness, out of necessity. And once that life was built, there was no room to reinsert me the way I wanted. I asked her if she still loved me. She thought carefully. Then she said, "I care about you. I respect you. I don't feel connected to you." That distinction hurt more than hate ever could, because you can fight hate. You can't fight absence. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I was shocked, but because everything finally made sense. Every quiet moment, every withdrawn glance, every polite interaction. She hadn't been punishing me. She had been protecting herself. Over the next few weeks, things stayed peaceful. That sounds strange, but it's true. No tension, no hostility, just a kind of emotional finality. We talked logistics, parenting, schedules, plans, but not us. That conversation was already over. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone, thinking back to the pregnancy, to the nights she cried quietly, to the questions she stopped asking, to the moments I chose silence because it felt safer. And for the first time, I saw it clearly. I hadn't just failed to support her, I had taught her that she was on her own. Here's something I didn't understand until much later. When someone stops needing you emotionally, they don't do it suddenly. They do it gradually, with practice, with repetition, with every unanswered reach. She wasn't angry anymore. That was the hardest part. Anger would have meant there was still something to fight for. What she had instead was clarity, and clarity is steady, unmovable. One evening, our child asked if everything was okay between us. She answered gently. She said, "We're figuring things out." I stayed quiet. Of course I did. And in that moment, I realized something painful. Silence had followed me through every stage of this story, from pregnancy to parenthood to loss. That night, she told me she wanted to separate emotionally, even if we stayed in the same house for now. She wasn't dramatic about it. She said it like someone choosing peace. She said, "I don't want to resent you." And that sentence broke me, because resentment would have meant I was still relevant. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. Not because I didn't care, but because for once I understood. I understood that staying silent during her most vulnerable season had taught her everything she needed to know about what she could expect from me, and no amount of late words could rewrite that lesson.
There's a strange loneliness that comes after clarity. Not the lonely feeling of being misunderstood, but the lonely feeling of finally understanding and knowing it doesn't change anything. That's where I lived after that conversation. We were still in the same house, still sharing space, still parenting together, but something fundamental had shifted. The air felt different. Not tense, just resolved. She moved with ease now. No hesitation, no emotional checking. She spoke to me the way you speak to someone you trust to be decent, but not intimate. Kind, respectful, distant. At first, I thought maybe time would soften things, that if I showed consistency long enough, if I stayed emotionally present long enough, something might reopen. But I misunderstood something critical. You can't reopen a door someone closed to survive. She wasn't punishing me. She wasn't holding a grudge. She was protecting her peace. And I had taught her how to do that by not being there when she needed protection the most. The hardest moments were the small ones, not the big conversations, the ordinary things, like sitting at the kitchen table across from her, both of us drinking coffee in silence,
not the comfortable kind, or hearing her laugh freely on the phone with a friend, then go quiet when she hung up, or realizing she stopped telling me about her day, not because she forgot, but because she didn't think of me as the place to put those thoughts anymore. Regret doesn't shout. It whispers in moments like those. One evening, I found an old photo. She was pregnant, standing in the living room, hands on her belly, smiling softly at the camera. I stared at that picture longer than I expected, because looking at it now, I could see what I missed then. Not joy, hope. Hope that I would meet her where she was. Hope that she wouldn't be alone. And that hope didn't survive. I started noticing how silence shows up in memory, not as absence, as space. Space where something should have been said. Space where comfort should have landed. Space where love should have spoken. Our child noticed the change too, not dramatically, but subtly. They asked fewer questions about us. They adjusted. Children are incredible adapters, and that scared me because adaptation isn't always healthy. Sometimes it's learned emotional restraint. Sometimes it's silence being passed down. One afternoon, my child said something that cut deep. They said, "You're quiet like me." They didn't mean it as criticism. They said it casually, but it landed heavy because I realized something in that moment. Silence doesn't stay contained. It teaches. I tried to change. Not loudly, not performatively, but genuinely. I listened more, asked questions, shared feelings, even when they felt awkward. But the difference was this. I was finally speaking to someone who no longer needed to hear it. That's the cruel thing about late growth. It's real, but it arrives after the window closes. One night, after everyone was asleep, she and I sat in the living room, not talking, just sharing space. She broke the silence. She said, "I don't hate you." That wasn't reassurance. It was closure. And closure doesn't ask for a response. I wanted to ask her if she ever wondered what things would have been like if I had shown up differently during the pregnancy, but I didn't, because I already knew the answer. She had wondered, she had hoped, and then she had let go. Grief doesn't always come from death. Sometimes it comes from realizing a version of your life ended quietly, without your permission. I started replaying moments, not obsessively, just involuntarily. Her asking questions I didn't answer, her sitting alone while pregnant, her saying, "I feel like I'm doing this alone," and me responding with silence instead of courage. Those moments felt heavier now, because now I understood their cost. Here's something I wish I'd known sooner. Silence doesn't freeze moments in time. It lets them pass without meaning. And once they pass, they don't come back asking to be handled better. There were days I felt anger. Not at her, at myself. At the version of me who thought being physically present was enough. At the version of me who thought silence was neutral. Silence is never neutral. It always communicates something. One morning, she told me she was considering moving out. Not urgently, just thoughtfully. She said she wanted space to fully live without emotional confusion. I understood, and that understanding hurt more than resistance would have. As she prepared for that next chapter, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. Not for the loss, but for the clarity. Because clarity is painful, but it's honest. And honesty was something I hadn't given her when it mattered most. The house feels different when one person leaves. Not emptier, just louder in its quiet. Every sound stands out. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floor, the absence of footsteps that used to be familiar. When she moved out, there were no arguments, no slammed doors. We planned it carefully, like adults who respected each other but no longer belonged to each other emotionally. The first night alone was strange. I sat on the couch where we'd once sat together in silence, only now there was no one across from me. And for the first time, silence didn't feel like avoidance, it felt like confrontation, because there was nothing left to distract me from it. I started noticing how much of my life had been built around not speaking, not expressing discomfort, not naming fear, not asking for reassurance. Silence wasn't just something I used with her, it was how I moved through the world. And now, it was the only thing keeping me company. Our child stayed with her most of the time. The house felt especially quiet on those nights. I tried to keep busy, work, television, scrolling, but silence has patience. It waits. I found myself thinking back, not just to the pregnancy, but to moments before it. Times when she tried to talk and I redirected. Times when I chose calm over connection. Times when I mistook emotional distance for maturity. I realized something painful. I had confused emotional restraint with emotional safety. They are not the same. One night, I cooked dinner for one. I set the table out of habit, 2 plates. I laughed softly at myself. That laugh turned into something else, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not dramatically, just quietly, because quiet was still my language. Regret at this stage doesn't ask for forgiveness, it asks for responsibility, and responsibility is heavier. I started going to therapy, not because I thought it would save the marriage, that door was closed, but because I needed to understand myself. The therapist asked questions I'd never asked myself about fear, about childhood, about silence. And for the first time, I had to answer without hiding behind being the calm one. I learned something uncomfortable. Silence had protected me from conflict, from vulnerability, from feeling inadequate. But it had cost someone else dearly, and love doesn't survive when one person is protected at the expense of the other. I started noticing how silence shows up in other relationships too. Friends who didn't really know me, family conversations that stayed surface level. I had built a life that didn't require much emotional risk, and it showed. One afternoon, my child asked if they could come over. They noticed the difference too, the quiet. They asked if I was okay. I wanted to give them a strong answer, but instead I chose honesty. I said, "I'm learning." They nodded. That was enough. I started practicing speaking, not eloquently, just honestly, saying things like, "I don't know how to talk about this yet," or "I'm feeling uncomfortable, but I want to stay present." Those sentences felt clumsy, but they were real, and real is better than quiet. I thought often about the pregnancy, about how much she had needed words then, about how I had withheld them, not out of cruelty, but fear. And fear, left unchecked, can be just as damaging as intention. One day I ran into her at a school event. We spoke politely, easily. She looked lighter. Not happier because I was gone, but freer. And that hurt in a way I hadn't expected, because it confirmed something. She didn't leave to hurt me. She left to heal herself. On the drive home, I said something out loud. To no one. I said, I should have spoken sooner. And the words echoed in the empty car. Silence has an expiration date. Eventually, it stops protecting you. Eventually, it forces you to listen. And when it does, it tells the truth clearly. There are lessons you learn early in life. And then there are lessons that wait. They wait until the damage is done, until the opportunity has passed, until you finally have the language, but no place left to use it. This is one of those lessons. I didn't lose my marriage because I was cruel. I didn't lose it because I was unfaithful. I lost it because I misunderstood what love required during vulnerability. I thought love meant stability, providing, not rocking the boat. I didn't understand that love, real love, requires participation. Pregnancy is not just physical, it's emotional exposure. It strips away certainty. It invites fear. It demands reassurance. And silence during that season is not neutral. It communicates distance. It says, you're alone with this, even when your body is still present. I thought staying meant I was doing enough. I thought silence was respectful. I thought calm was kindness. But silence, when someone is asking to be seen, becomes neglect. Quiet neglect. The kind that doesn't leave bruises, but leaves scars. Here's the truth I had to face. You can be faithful and still abandon someone emotionally. You can stay and still leave them alone. You can mean well and still cause lasting harm. If you're listening to this and you're pregnant or loving someone who is, hear this clearly. Your partner doesn't need perfection. They need presence. They need words. They need to know their fear has somewhere to land. And if you're listening to this years later, looking back, understand this. Late regret is real, but it doesn't always repair what was lost. Sometimes, all it does is teach you who you needed to be. I learned that silence teaches people how to live without you. It teaches self-reliance where connection should be. It teaches emotional independence where partnership was needed. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't unlearn easily. I also learned that growth after loss is still growth, that responsibility doesn't always come with redemption, that sometimes the lesson isn't about fixing the past, it's about not repeating it. Today, when I speak, I do it intentionally. Not loudly, not perfectly, but honestly. I speak because I know what silence costs. I speak because I know presence matters more than comfort. I speak because I don't want the people I love to ever wonder if they're carrying something alone. If there's one thing I hope you take from this story, it's this. Don't confuse quiet with care. Don't wait until the moment passes to find your voice. Don't let fear of saying the wrong thing stop you from saying something. Because silence feels safe until it's all you have left. And by then, the person you needed to speak to may no longer be listening. This is the rooted lesson. Staying isn't enough. Love has to be heard. Thank you for listening.